Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's boot camp for EDR optimization in standalone EDR from Enable. We're going to go slow for the first few minutes, just allow any additional attendees to get in. We did have quite a few that registered. We're just not going to leave them all behind, so we really won't get into this for probably another 2 or 3 minutes into the real content of the boot camp. But just to get some of the legalese out of the way before we start, if we make any forward-looking statements today about time on deliveries, features, anything that we're going to be doing at a future date, and just take it with a grain of salt and realize plans change, and what we think we might be able to do today isn't really what we get to. So don't make any hard business decisions based on any forward-looking statements today. For those that are here that have already been using EDR, we also have to temper a little bit for those who have not been using EDR. This may be really your first exposure to it. So there's a few things we're going to go through before we get into the actual demonstration within product. And that's just to get everybody on the same page, but also it helps set up some understanding for some concepts we'll be going over later, because you're going to need to have confidence in what the platform is doing, so you'll be able to make your decisions about how you're going to build your workflows and how you're going to build your services around EDR going forward. We're going to start that out with just legacy antivirus versus Enable. This is EDR. This is going to be a lot of people's first time dealing with a solution like EDR. You've been using traditional AV solutions and endpoint protection platforms for years. There is a change in what the core operation of EDR is, what it's doing, and how you can leverage it. That's worth taking a minute or two to go over. This chart does a really good job of simplifying that we're going to compare, a traditional AV against EDR and what the response is going to be, what the capabilities are. With the standard AV, something happens, it detects it, it kills the process, quarantines the payload files, you get a notification, that's it, that's all that happens. That has been traditional AV behavior since we've had AVs. So that's where it stops. With EDR, you still get the kill quarantine step, but there's also the option to isolate an endpoint during a threat event. So whenever EDR detects a threat, it can isolate the machine on the network so it can no longer communicate with anything on the network until it resolves the threat issue, and then it reconnects it to the network. And that is something traditionally that has been hidden behind, well, not hidden behind, but something you wouldn't have access to unless you had network security appliances, managed switches, and a lot of integration going on to facilitate something like that. This is giving you a software-defined way of this making this behavior happen, which significantly lowers the bar for where you can apply this at. Then there's the ability for EDR, because it is a kernel-level product that has knowledge of everything that happened on the system. It knows what was changed on the system. So it knows what files were downloaded during that threat event, and it can remove them. It knows what files were created out of whole cloth during that event, and it can remove them. And it can also restore any registry or OS configuration changes that were made to it during a threat event to their prior value for you. And then it can also revert whole files back to their previous state with the rollback feature, leveraging VSS snapshots for any files that were modified during a threat event. So this is a significant step up in capabilities from traditional AV that is here for you to take advantage of. And this is going to later on be part of what's compelling your decision making on what do you do for. Do I want remediate to be an automatic action? Do I want rollback to be an automatic action? And we'll go through the logic of why you would pick one over the other a little later. But there's also something else that's worth going over, because it helps, is to set a certain expectation for your confidence in the product, so that you can change the way you deal with incident response, the way that you handle whenever your AV catches something. So the MITRE attack evaluation. So if you have any familiarity with who MITRE is, great. If not, they're a nonprofit organization that are responsible for the attack and defend frameworks, also a lot of other things that are industry recognized. But every year they do evaluation of security products. And last year they did Carbonac and Fin7, two ATP groups, and they just put a bunch of different security software solutions through the ringer. They said, all right, we're going to test their capabilities to defend against these attacks that these types of groups are using. And just on the pure metric of did it catch it or not, EDR, SentinelOne, what we're using, was on the top of the list. They were able to detect all 174 of the 174 steps of the attacks that they were testing against. So they did not miss anything. And you'll see, just in descending order here, this is just what happened. We tested it. These products did not catch it, or did not catch some of these steps. And you'll see that it's fairly impressive that, even with more of the traditional products like Bitdefender, Trend Micro, with their solutions, they're still catching a lot, but EDR was the only one that caught everything. So whenever you're looking and evaluating just off of the efficacy of will it catch something, EDR is on top of the stack pretty much. Now, analytic detections, this is based on, well, it's not just the fact that EDR can detect and catch something, but that there's telemetry and information available to the product, to EDR, to a technician to, discover more additional things about what's happening in the environment. And again, this is where, EDR is on top of the stack. For 174 of the steps, it was able to collect that information about 159 of the steps. And then delayed detection. So this is an important thing to, unpacking this, is that out of these solutions, what were the delayed detection? So it was not done at the time on the endpoint that it was detected, but rather the information on the endpoint was outsourced to another service somewhere, to a cloud service or to a server somewhere on site, to do the evaluation of the threat based on the telemetry and then push decisions back down to the endpoint. SentinelOne EDR is up here at 0 because all the decision making is happening on the endpoint in real time. It does not have to rely on outsourced resources to make its judgment call. And that's one of the things I want to drive home, is that it does not have to communicate with outside infrastructure. It can make the decisions in real time on the endpoint and still get that high efficacy rate. So this whole thing is here to help give you a little bit more confidence in EDR's capability, that when it finds something and detects it, it's detecting everything about what happened as best as any product can do. So you can have a little bit more confidence in letting it make those automated decisions and perform the remediations for you. And then configuration changes. This is just to point out that out of these different solutions, when they were testing it, if a product missed something and didn't catch it, they gave the vendor an opportunity to tweak, to modify their product to try and catch it. And the point of this one is just to bring forward the point that EDR did not have to make any changes. The default out of the box configuration for EDR was able to detect everything that was being thrown at it. So that's another important thing that's going to come in later for our decision-making process and how we're going to configure EDR. And these previous slides are just here to just, again, get a little bit more confidence in what the platform is doing for you, the validity and the worth of the information that it is feeding back to you, that it is good information. It's probably as good as you're going to get with this type of a solution. And productivity and operational gains. So this is where we're going to start talking about the operations side of things, not just what EDR itself is capable of, but the services you're going to build around it, the workflow you're going to build around it. So for an AV response timeline, so this is if you're just using a regular AV, like the Bitdefender that is integrated inside of RMM and Central as AV Defender or managed AV. You're using something like that. Threat event occurs at 0 time. It's detected. The AV kills it and quarantines it. That's, of course, that's all that the AV does. It kills it, quarantines it, and then you'll get a notification back in your management platform somewhere that says, and hey, I caught a thing, and that it's usually going to be, if you're using RMM or Central, that could be about 15 minutes based on endpoint check-in frequency. But that goes through your notification, your workflows, a PSA integration, a ticket gets generated, and by the time a technician picks it up, it's maybe 15 minutes later. And then they're going to start doing investigations. They have to look into it. They have to go to the dashboard and see what they can find about this particular event. And if you're using something like we have with the traditional AVs, well, only thing you're really going to know is the time, the drive location, a generic descriptor of whatever the AV decided to call that threat, and the action that was taken, detected, quarantined, whatever. If you want, but that's all you get. You don't really know what happened to the endpoint during this event. So if you want to know what happened to the endpoint in that event, you have to go do some actual endpoint investigation. You're going to have to log into that machine. You're going to have to interrupt somebody's productivity, scooch them out of their chair for a little while. And since you don't have any real information, though, you don't have any real telemetry about what happened, you have to start manually digging or using a tool to start digging. So you might start looking at log files. You may go get an open source tool like Chainsaw or something else, but you have to start digging for information and find out. But you're basically going in blind. And then at some point, you have to just say, well, I found what I can find. Let me move into the remediation stage. And this is out of personal experience from myself, as from being in an MSP before, as well as the conversation I've had with a lot of our partners. When you don't have good actionable intelligence and telemetry to know what actually happened to a system during a threat event, the only thing you can really do is start throwing stuff at the wall. You spray and pray. You run a repair utility, a cleanup tool, a system restore. You run another AV scan with another AV product, and you're just hoping that something sticks. And then eventually you have to call it quits. At some point, you have to say, okay, I've spent enough time on this. Nothing seems wrong on the system. Let me close out this ticket, write my notes, and move on to the next thing. Problem there is you honestly have no confidence that you actually addressed anything. You can run all those different scans and still might miss changes in configuration alterations that were made to the system, or something that an attacker left behind on the system for persistence reasons. And this can take anywhere from 30 minutes, 50 minutes to 3 hours. A good example of this, of real world, because this is what I've been through before myself, AV catches something. You're like, okay, AV caught it, it killed it, quarantined it, it's taken care of. You acknowledge it in the dashboard. But then a help desk ticket comes in from that same machine. Help, my desktop background is black and I can't change it back to my kid's soccer photo. Well, you got to go work that ticket. You're going to have to go to that system, see that the background is black, and you just can't right click and change the background. And you're going to correlate things. You're going to say, well, this machine just had an event on it. AV caught something, and apparently this is the damage from it. But you still don't know what damage it was. The only thing you know is the symptom, not the cause or anything else. And that's why you have to revert to the spray and pray. Repair tools, cleanup utility systems, stores, whatever you got to throw at it to get it back in what you assume is a good state. Compare this against what's that workflow is going to look like with EDR. You're going to have that event occur at 0 time. It's going to be picked up. It's going to be killed, quarantined. But if you have the remediation set as an automatic response, you could theoretically just be done and walk away from it. If your goal with EDR is simply because I know I need something better than just antivirus, but I do not want to spend more time managing something, then you could do this, no problem. You can set it to automatic remediation, and by the time, within a few seconds, sometimes, most of the time in less than 30 seconds, after EDR catches something, qualifies it as a threat, and starts that remediation, it's done. And then you're going to get that event reported into the dashboard within about 2 minutes. And that can flow into whatever your PSA notification systems, help desk ticketing, whatever. And at that point, once the technician grabs that, starts working the ticket, all of the information they need is in the dashboard. They do not have to go log into the endpoint. They have the information in EDR about what changes were made to the system during that threat event, and that it's already been remediated, and that you can verify that those changes were remediated. And then a technician and do a little bit a quick audit of that, verify it. Yep, sure, everything was taken care of. And then your response is pretty much complete. You can write an incident report, you can close the ticket, put in your notes, and you're done. And this can be as little time as you want to afford it, but you still get that same result on the endpoint of threat was detected, changes to the system were reverted. Everything else you want to do around that is open for basically how inventive or how big your imagination is around what kind of service you want to build around it. And this transition and knowing and having the confidence in the product because of all of this telemetry and knowledge that it's now exposing for you is going to lead to some improvements. You should be seeing a reduction in the number of help desk tickets for user experience issues, because it's from the as far as the end user experience is going to be, they open up a malicious payload file, whatever it is, their screen might flash for just half a second as their black background resets or whatever, and then they'll get a notification down in the bottom right from EDR that threat detected, threat dealt with, and that's it. It's all taken care of already. You can gain more confidence in knowing a threat incident has been resolved because of that knowledge about everything that was happening during that particular threat event. You know, anything that was changed by it has already been reverted back to its prior states. You should be seeing less time spent by technicians on cleanup and remediation tasks because they don't have to do the spray and pray approach. There should be less time on the intelligence gathering because they don't have to interrupt end users. They don't have to go to the endpoint and find this information. It's right back in the dashboard for them. You're also going to see less secondary payloads, which are usually more dangerous, because EDR is going to be, because the way it works, it's going to be monitoring and stopping things earlier in their attack chain. And we'll kind of get into how does that do that later. And then also this should helpfully lead to less stress for technicians because they no longer have to make educated guesses. And depending on what your role is, if you are sales, marketing, or you're an operations manager and you're not really in the trenches and have a good working knowledge of how your incident response works for whenever your AV flags something, this is heartburn. This is headache for a lot of technicians because they have to make all of those educated guesses and cross their fingers sometimes. And this is not a comfortable position to be in, because you're constantly worried, I missed something and it's going to come back and bite me. This can help get rid of that kind of stress for you. So building a service around this. So I wanted to take the time to go through what EDR can offer you in reference to what you may have previously been able to do with standard AV, because there is a lot of different ways that you can decide to implement EDR. And I've got that represented as kind of just three simple ideas here. There's the simple way of, all right, you're going to treat it just the same as AV. Again, you know you need something better than traditional AV, but you do not want to spend more time, effort, or have to learn significant new skills in order to operate it. Fine, you do not have to. You just install EDR with the policy set to kill, quarantine, and remediate, and you get all of the benefits that we've gone over so far as the automatic remediation and it being something you don't have to be involved in. And you can, hopefully, this is going to reduce your management time on a lot of things. You're not going to have to make sure that the AVs are updated. You're not going to have to make sure that the AV is running a daily quick scan or a weekly deep scan, because that is not how the product operates. So there's all types of administrative time, busy work, technicians, labor that really it can evaporate once you start leveraging an EDR solution. An improved way of using it, you're still, kind of just treating it as a better AV, but you're also going to leverage some of the additional hardening measures that are available inside of EDR. such as the network control, which allows you to have a centralized way to manage what's happening with the Windows firewall on the endpoint. The USB controller gives you control over the USB settings on the machine. So you can start blocking USB devices based on serial ID, on vendor, on class, and we'll get into some practical applications for that in a minute. And also for Bluetooth control, but you're still setting the policy just to kill, quarantine, and remediate as an automatic action because you're still wanting it to be as automated as possible, little interaction as possible. And you're marketing it and selling it as such. You're still going to be getting that reduced management time. Now, if you want to go the advanced route, this is where you're going to, let's push the boundaries of what we can achieve with EDR. This is where you're going to take EDR and you're going to change it into an MDR, to a managed detection and response, because you're assuming the role of the management part. You're still going to be using the network, USB, Bluetooth controls, turning on and enabling the network quarantine feature. So whenever there's an active threat on the machine, that machine is isolated and it's not posing a threat to the rest of the environment. But you'll be setting the policy to kill quarantine, because part of what you're marketing and selling with the MDR is whenever a threat event occurs, we are going to investigate that threat event and decide if additional remediation or mitigation efforts are warranted. And if a technician decides that yes, or your security analyst, whatever name tag you've got them wearing, decides yes, it should be remediated, it's just a button push away. They can push the button and EDR will leverage all of the knowledge it has and telemetry it has about that event to revert the changes to the system for you. And this, again, this is a significant, a significant labor and time investment to switch to this model, but this is how you go from making just 40% margin on it just by selling it as a simple AV up to 300, 500, 600% margin, because you're building a whole service around it. And the sky's not the limit, but implementing it this way is how you start getting a managed services contract where you're charging plus $100 per endpoint. So hardening with EDR. So hardening systems is a very important concept whenever it comes to security and layer and security in depth, and just about any security framework you come across. There are going to be measures and controls for hardening systems. EDR helps make some of that fairly trivial for you. So for Bluetooth, you have the ability to say, we're not going to allow any old Bluetooth protocol devices in the environment because the protocol is unsecure and it's very susceptible to snooping. It's inconsequential for an attacker to come in with a device and sniff the radio frequencies being emitted by a Bluetooth keyboard to do key logging. Now, is that a very particular attack vector? Is that likely to happen to many environments? No, but it is one of those things that can happen. And since it's so trivial to be able to control that, it's worthwhile, figuring out, are we going to put this in our baseline of our services? Because there's also business opportunities here on just hardware sales. You're able to say, all right, we're going to say, make the security case that anything lower than version, 4.1, because of the vulnerabilities that exist in the Bluetooth protocol, we aren't comfortable allowing that in the environment for security reasons. So we're going to check and make sure that your devices, your keyboards, your mice, your headsets are all using higher versions of this before you flip the switch and turn it off. And that's some hardware sales. There is a good, compelling security argument for why you're insisting on them replacing, as far as what an end user is going to see, perfectly usable equipment. You can do the same, similar with USB. You can create rules to allow specific USB devices to connect while blocking all other USB devices. One of the examples, medical clients, CPAs, lawyers, they do not want information coming in or leaving their environments on an unapproved channel. This is part of DLP, data loss protection. So you're able to set up a rule that says, all right, we're going to block any USB-based device that is a mass storage device from being mounted on an endpoint that's using the policy. But so that's going to stop any old random flash drive or USB hard drive from being used in the environment. But you can create another rule that allows USB storage devices based on specific serial IDs. That way you can harden the environment, block those unknown devices from being used, but the box of pre-approved encrypted USB drives, here you go. I can sell you these with a markup, and bonus, hardening environment hardware sale. Of course, there's even more with it, with the network capabilities of the EDR agent. So EDR has the ability to isolate an endpoint when there's an active threat. And then you can add additional rules to allow communication to support infrastructure, to management infrastructure. So if you wanted to be really secure about it, you could say, all right, we're going to use the network isolation feature, but I'm going to allow communication at this client site to a jump box, to a management PC that you have in the environment, so that you can reach over from that machine over RDP to do your troubleshooting and your investigation whenever a machine goes offline because of the network quarantine. And the whole purpose of this is so that whenever there is an active threat on a machine, so that you can prevent lateral movement within the environment. And so now I'm going to switch over into a live environment here of EDR and go through a few of the things that we've been talking about. Feel free, if you've got any questions, anything you want me to show off in particular, throw that into the questions panel, and I'll answer those as we go. So just starting out with the EDR dashboard. A few things for orientation purposes to make your life easier, and also hopefully to save you from some irritation in the future. Just talking about the scope. So the scope inside of EDR is built off of a main account, site, and then groups structure. So you'll have your main account, and then underneath that account, you have individual sites. And then underneath each individual site, you will have groups. The purpose of the sites is to represent your different clients. It is very much in your best interest to create a site per client, because a lot of the reporting, a lot of the notifications, and some other things are going to revolve around site level designation. So if you want to have reporting and notifications specific for individual clients, you are going to need to have individual sites per client. And whenever you're changing in the scope, you have to be careful or mindful, because that's going to update the context of whatever it is you're looking at. So here I'm in the Sentinels area, and if I go back up to I'm up here at the top level, well, I'm looking at everything at once for all of my clients across the board. If I want to make changes or investigate something, I have to go down to that individual level. Everything updates and reflects that I'm now at that level. The policy. So we're going to go through the policy real quick, just again, for anybody that has not been using EDR, to get you familiar with some of these settings, but also for those who have already been using EDR. Hopefully giving you a better explanation of what these settings are and why you should choose one over the other. So first, you have the ability to put EDR in detect only mode. Whenever it is in detect only mode, it is only going to detect things. It will not take actions against what it finds. But if it does find something, you'll have the opportunity after the fact to tell it to kill, quarantine, and remediate any of the changes that were made to the system by whatever that threat was, because, well, it has that knowledge. This is very useful for whenever you're first using EDR in a new environment. It does not matter what type of security solution it is, AV, advanced AV, whatever. You never know how it's going to respond and how an environment is going to respond to it whenever it's first installed. That's why you do test deployments. So for those test deployments, set up your policy for detect only mode. Allow it to run for an hour, 2 hours, a half a day, whatever you're comfortable with saying, all right, these endpoints have done what they normally do in this amount of time. This is probably everything that happens in the environment. Let me start with this as my baseline. And then you can use the incidents tab here. While you're dialing this in, you will see those items pop up. You'll see them show up in here, and you'll be able to make that decision of a very simplified way of doing it, but it's functional. If you see something in here that EDR has found and I don't recognize it as something I use, I don't recognize it as something that the client uses, and nobody's calling to complain that their stuff's not working because EDR is blocking it, well, you know what? It's perfectly fine that EDR stopped it. So I can tell it that, all right, yeah, cool, you blocked that, great. Let me mark that off as a resolved event. And the purpose of marking it off as a resolved event is so that whenever myself or another technician comes in after me, they're not wasting time reevaluating the same thing again. Because even with like in RMM or in Central, with what we currently have for Bitdefender, it takes you a few seconds to look and see, is this an old event? Is it a new event? And even if it is a newer event, you still don't know if anybody's addressed it or not. You have to go to your ticketing system to find that out. This allows you to address it, right in here as you're going through it. I can mark it as resolved, and whenever I'm in here, well, I'm only ever going to be looking at the unresolved things because that's what requires my attention. But if I see something in here and I do recognize it, I know what it is. This is perfectly fine and should be available for use. I can take and say, well, all right, I'm going to add that to my exclusions. Hit save, I'm done. It takes just 2 or 3 clicks to do it. So it does not take a lot of effort to get EDR dialed in for an environment. Back to the policy. And that whole ease of adding exclusions is why I usually recommend for the suspicious threats also having it set to protect, because there has to be a threshold between what is not a threat, what could be a threat, and what is definitely a threat. We are offering you the opportunity to treat the could be the same as the definitely. You will have a more secure environment if you do this. However, you are increasing the likelihood you're going to have to add more exclusions in the beginning and potentially more exclusions down the road. Some, the tradition, a lot of traditional thought on this is that those are false positives and that they are an inconvenience that should be avoided. I tend to think of it another way, that you've already taken the time and the effort to set up an environment as it should be, to dial it in with EDR, and it's 3 months later, 4 months later, somebody tries to make alterations in the environment. They try to add a piece of software, install an update to a piece of software, whatever it is, and it gets flagged by EDR as a suspicious thing and it's blocked. Well, you might get an angry email or phone call about that. From my point of view, you were doing what you were supposed to do. A new piece of unidentified software or alterations to the environment were occurring. You did not know about it, and you did what you were supposed to do. You stopped it. That's kind of my view on it. Are you going to butt heads with certain people over that type of a view of it? Yes, you will, but it's probably the more accurate view for an MSP. Something unknown was happening in the environment, and we stopped it because that is our job. Our job is to prevent potentially bad things from happening. We now need to have a conversation about what appropriate change control is, why we should be involved in this process. So, personal preference on that one, I will always have it on protect for suspicious items. The different engines over here, just a quick review of those again for anybody that has not been through a good EDR, now has not had a good EDR explainer before. The reputation engine, this is the closest thing to traditional AV behavior the product has. This is a giant list of bad files. See the bad file, block the bad file. The static AI engines are looking at files pre-execution while they are still flat files on the system that have not been loaded to run. And it's trying to detect if it can see any red flags that make it say that's a bad thing. So repackaged executables, malicious binaries inside of them, Cyrillic letters, and the manifest for an executable. Really, just any red flag that says, if this runs, it will probably do a bad thing. Then there's the behavioral AI engine, and this is really where the horsepower of the product is. Underpinning this is an AI-derived threat model. And what is being fed into that threat model is everything that the that EDR knows about the system, because it is a kernel level product that is doing driver injections on all processes. It knows every process that launched, every child process that spawns off of it, the arguments that are passed back and forth, the registry key changes. That is all known to EDR. It's passing it through that AI derived threat model in real time on the endpoint to make the decision of, has this passed a threshold into a threat, and should I stop it? And that's what allows it to. And that is one of the reasons why EDR has such high efficacy when compared to all the other products, is because it has changed its approach from the predictive nature of, I see something about this file that I don't like and I will stop it, to the view of, and the approach of, we're just going to monitor everything as it happens and decide what if, and decide that, make our decisions based on what is actually happening to the system in real time. And even though that sounds aggressive and like it would be a massive resource hog, in reality, it's not, because, well, you're only working with how hard the computer is currently working anyway. It's only monitoring the currently active processes. So there's not as much overhead with this as you might expect. Documents and scripts, PDFs, Word documents, spreadsheets, things of that nature. Lateral movement is for dealing with attacks that are making lateral movement within your network. So think of things like one computer in an environment being compromised, or an unmanaged system being brought into the network and connected to the Wi-Fi, and attacks like Eternal Blue, NotPetya, WannaCry, and even Cobalt Strike, those types of things. Exploitation and fileless, browser-based attacks, secondary malware payloads, things where you have a good example of this is a Windows Office document that has macros in it. They get the document through email. It says enable macros to read. They enable macros that cause a PowerShell script, and that PowerShell script has obfuscated code inside of it that says, go out, download this payload from a malicious C2 server, reconstruct it, and put it directly into memory. That's for dealing with those types of attacks. Potentially unwanted applications. This is for Macs specifically, and it does exactly what it says, blocks unwanted applications. Application control is for Linux devices, specifically containerized Linux. And then the detect interactive threat, this is here for an insider threat. And by insider threat, it means somebody who is sitting on a machine with administrator credentials, regardless of whether they deserve those credentials or not. If they have those credentials because of a compromise somewhere else, or because of exploiting a vulnerability, whatever, is to monitor what's happening as far as command line and PowerShell inputs on the endpoint for malicious commands. This is a significant piece of system hardening that you're getting from EDR by putting this in place. You do not get this with any regular AV. You do not even get it with many next-gen AVs or other endpoint protection platforms. It's not wholly unique, but it is impressive that it is a native part of the product, and that it's able to make the decisions that it's going to be making locally without having to output that telemetry somewhere else for another service, another solution somewhere else to make those decisions, and then come back at a later time, which can be seconds, minutes, or sometimes days, depending on what kind of SLAs you have with whatever that SOC SIM or other thing is, and really narrows the gap on an event occurring and it being detected and it being remediated. Once EDR makes that call and says something is a threat and it stops it, well, there's the first step of kill and quarantine. These protection levels down here, this is not an on-off switch for that feature. It is simply saying, I want it to be the automatic response. And what you choose here is less of a technical decision and more of a sales decision. If you're selling EDR simply as a better AV, and you do not want to put any more time into managing it or responding to it than you have to, then you can set it the automatic rollback for, just let it do its thing. It catches something, it kills it, it quarantines it, it rolls it back. You don't have to be involved in it whatsoever. But if you are selling it as, again, a more involved service, where you're treating it more as an MDR, then you may probably leave it at kill and quarantine. And part of what you're being paid for the service is for your technicians to take the time to look at the threat event, evaluate it, and decide if additional remediation or mitigation is warranted. And maybe that's also including taking some of that information out of the threat event. Did it make a connection to an external IP address during this threat? If it did, well, that's probably a malicious C2 server for malware infrastructure or something. Block it on the perimeter firewall, or go block it in, maybe also go block it on your other clients' firewalls as a preventative measure. But there are technical reasons some days why you may not choose to have rollback or remediate as an automatic action. And that's usually because you have touchy systems. You have a server or an endpoint that is running either antiquated software or software from a vendor that's out of business. You don't have the installation media anymore. It's just really, you're afraid to even sneeze around the thing. In those cases, you might still want to say, well, okay, fine, we'll just leave it at kill and quarantine, so it stops the threat in its tracks, so it stops it. And I'm going to review what it finds before I push the button to let it remediate or do a rollback to make sure it's not going to affect anything on the system that I don't want it to affect. Then there's the disconnect from network option down here. Click the button, it's turned on. It's that simple. You now have endpoint node isolation for when a threat event is detected on them. Again, normally this is something that took network security appliances and managed switches to be able to achieve. You can now deliver this in a software-defined way that significantly lowers the bar for it, the cost for it. You can start offering it in more locations because of this. And also with the transition to work from home, you now have a way of offering this to work from home individuals without having to invest in equipment. Of course, caveat emptor, if you're going to use this, you have to understand it and what the implications of it are. If you turn this on, the behavior is as soon as EDR detects something as a threat, it switches the status of the agent to active threat. And it will turn on the local Windows firewall and block all communication in and out of the system, except back to the EDR instance. And it's going to keep blocking it for as long as that endpoint stays in the active threat status. Now, if EDR is successful at doing its job of killing, quarantining, and remediating the threat, then it's going to move back out of that active threat status in just a few seconds, maybe even less than a second. So for the end user, they're not even going to notice anything. Again, it's going to be like they clicked on something and nothing happened. If it fails that kill quarantine step, well, that is a concern. If it sees a threat and it can't stop that threat, yes, it is a very good thing that EDR can lock down that computer and keep it from communicating with anything else on the network to prevent the possible propagation of an attack. Now, you're turning it on, you're statistically increasing your likelihoods of a headache. So you want to make sure that if you are going to do this, you have buy-in from stakeholders and that you even have it figured into the margin of your services. So you're getting paid to manage the headache. Of course, if you are going to use it, you're probably also going to want to take advantage of the network control. The network control, first, it gives you a way to manage and centralize the management of your local Windows firewall on endpoints or on Macs. It does not replace the OS firewall. It just gives you a way to centralize your control over it. But for the network quarantine, so whenever this is fired off and the machine is isolated, it's still going to talk back to the EDR dashboard so you can get the information that you need to make your decision, so you know if you want to push the button for it to reconnect or not. But you can also come in here and tell it to allow connections to a remote host. So I could say, maybe you have a jump box internally in the environment, a management PC that's on site. Well, you can go ahead and give it that IP address in here. That way, if an endpoint using this policy gets isolated on the network, you can just go hit your management PC and RDP over to the machine. Or if you want to, you can Find what your support infrastructure is. So if you're using Take Control, N-Central, RMM, go find what those what the IP addresses are for the communication needed to that infrastructure. Add it here, and you should be able to preserve your connection to your management platforms. Is this a worthwhile feature? Yes, it is. Is this significantly more than what you may have traditionally done? Yes, it is. But it's something that is a worthwhile capability to add to your portfolio. So it's worthwhile testing it out, seeing how it behaves, maybe on a few test clients, get comfortable with it, because honestly, one of your goals, if you are going to be using EDR and you do not have the network equipment in place to be able to do automated node isolation in the event that a threat is detected, your goal should be to enable this and configure it and have it working as you expect it to. For the device control, so just a quick, we already went over, a little bit of these, but just, to see how simple it actually is, we're going to add a rule for Bluetooth. And that's going to be based on the Bluetooth version, and we're going to block anything lower than version 4.1. Hit save, done. Any endpoint that's using this policy that's at the site level is going to have that rule applied to them. Again, don't just turn this on a whim. Make sure that you have buy-in from stakeholders and that it's understood that this might mean some pieces of equipment like like keyboards or mice or a headset might need to be replaced. So that's something better addressed ahead of time rather than after. Or we can do it for, again, USB devices. So I can come in here and say I'm going to block USB devices based on the class of mass storage. There we go. It's that easy. Or, medical clients. You're not supposed to be able to just print whatever you want to a USB printer on somebody's desktop in a medical office. So it's supposed to be going to a print server, or it's supposed to be going to a floor printer in the middle of the office, somewhere that whatever's printed can be audited. So you can say, I'm also going to block printers. It's that easy. I'm blocking only USB printers, so somebody can't just bring in, this is kind of, a way to deal with shadow IT. Somebody can't just bring in any old USB printer, plug it in, and start working with it. If you want to really control it, you can put in this rule to block printers based on, just all USB printers. But then I can go back and allow specific USB printers based on their serial ID. Same with the USB devices. You can take and block the USB devices based on the class of mass storage. But then I can come right back around again and have an allow rule for USB devices based on a specific serial ID. So nobody can just bring in a random flash drive, external hard drive, and take information out or bring information in. But I can give you a box of pre-approved encrypted USB drives at a markup. See, no questions coming in, so I'm going to keep rolling. We got a little bit more to fit in before the end of the hour. Just something to touch on really quickly in packages, and this is another one of those reasons why doing different sites per client is important. If you want to install standalone EDR, you can simply come in here and you can find the package for the OS that you would like, Mac, Linux, or PC. Download it, run it, and it's going to ask for the site token. That's going to automatically join it to the correct site, and whatever policy you have enabled to that site is going to be applied. If, of course, you need assistance deploying that, if you have never been to the Automation Cookbook before, we have our Automation Cookbook website. It's just a repository of a bunch of automations, checks, and tasks and service monitors that our partners have created and have decided they're willing to share with the rest of the community, or they're the ones that we've created, and to help a client with a specific request. But they're all in here and they're available to use and test and play with and modify however you need. For EDR, you need to be able to deploy EDR. We do have a deployment script in here for you, so you don't have to figure it out for yourself. All you have to provide it is the site token. We also have in here, while we're looking at it, we also have the VSS Snapshot Age Monitor in here. This is useful for using with EDR for the rollback feature. So as impressive as the rollback feature is, you have to be able to have some type of, you have to have some type of idea of, is it going to work? You can't just say, oh yeah, sure, it'll work. You can never, there's a reason why audits exist. It's to verify things are going to work when you need them to work. So this monitor is very good for being able to let you know, hey, this device has not created a snapshot in more than 24 hours. That means your rollback ability is compromised potentially. You should investigate. It's not a guarantee that your rollback will work, but it's a guarantee that your rollback's probably not going to work if this is triggering. So it's very much worthwhile having in your environment. All right, I got a good question in here. So far, everything that I have covered in this standalone presentation, you have available in the integrated versions. So the integrated version within N-central and RMM, nothing so far I've covered is not available in those versions of it. Everything is the same. The policies are the same. The functionality on the endpoints is the same. The only difference is how you deploy and notifications. There's some other differences, but for the most part, as everything I've covered so far, you can do it with the integrated versions. I'm about to get, though, into the things that are not available with the integrated versions. And if you are already on the integrated version, I always advise, okay, there are probably perfectly legitimate reasons why you may need to make the transition to the standalone version for some of the functionality, but it's always worthwhile going one-on-one with a sales engineer or one of the partner success engineers to, identify what those reasons are, and just to make sure that you're not missing the equivalent functionality for it that's already available in the integrated version. Just honestly, nobody told you it was there. But now, yeah, I am going to start getting into some of this is the difference between the standalone and the integrated version. One of those things is the ability to deploy an individual agent whenever you feel like it, not conjoined to the RMM or N-central in any way. And also the support for Mac and Linux is a big difference. So if you have a lot of Macs or you have a lot of Linux devices you need to be able to support with EDR, you are going to need the standalone version. Another thing with the standalone version is the applications. This is not in the integrated versions. This gives you the ability to say, all right, well, what software has been discovered on my endpoints and what vulnerabilities are associated with those pieces of software. This is not anything that you're going to use to fix anything, as in there's no action to take in here, but it does give you the ability to see what vulnerabilities exist in your environment as far as the software goes. So this will tell you, here's the piece of software, here are the vulnerabilities associated with it, here's the CVE for it, the severity score, a link out to the MITRE database if you want to read up on it a little bit more. Use this as a second set of eyes. No solution is ever 100%. Again, this is why you have auditing and why you should be doing auditing. Doesn't matter what patching solution you're using, whether it's WSUS or RMM's patch management or N-central's patch management. They don't patch all software. Even third-party patching solutions don't patch all software. You still need to have some type of awareness of if something's getting missed for whatever reason. So this can surface things that, okay, we're missing that, we need to go patch it. But it also can surface things that you cannot patch, such as right here, Adobe Shockwave Player. There is no fix for this vulnerability. You cannot patch it. There is no update. The only fix is to remove it from the environment, which has been advised for many, many, many years at this point. So if you have a client that uses a line of business software that still relies on this, this can be part of the ammunition you need to go sit down and have that hard conversation of, look, this cannot be in your environment anymore. It cannot be allowed because, well, it has a severity score rating of 10. And maybe your client has to worry about PCI DSS compliance. Well, unless my recall is off, Anything higher, any CVSS score higher than a 4 means you're outside of PCI compliance. It's a flag. You're not going to pass. So this may be there is no choice. You must get rid of this. But of course, if they get rid of it, their line of business software is not going to be able to display documents anymore, which means they got to go get a new line of business software. And you're now, this simple fix of uninstalling Shockwave, which would only take you a few minutes, has now put the client, the end user, the business in a position of, oh, well, now we got to figure out how to budget in another $10,000, $20,000 to purchase licenses for a new line of business software. And that's whenever the risk conversation meets the business conversation. And who wins sometimes is based on how compelling of a story you can tell. For some other features, again, this is other stuff that is available in the standalone that is not available in the integrated. You have the activity, which will give you just a readout of anything and everything that happens concerning the EDR agents on the endpoints and actions that users take in the EDR dashboard. Reports are available. Reports are coming to the integrated versions. It should be fairly, probably not within the next month, but could possibly be within the last of the year or Q1 of next year. So this reporting will be available inside of the integrated versions. These are all reports that you can set up to run recurring or on demand. There's multiple different reports, and really I can't tell you which one is the best or which one you should use. The only thing you can really do is generate each report, look at it, and see if it serves the purpose that you need it for. But you can set these up to be, one-time reports, scheduled reports, weekly, once a month, and you can even designate who it's being emailed to on an automated basis. Then there's notifications. So down here in settings, this is another one of those significant differences, but one that we are closing the gap on. Whenever we get reporting into the integrated version, we should also be getting this elevated version of the notifications in. Right now, notifications are based on policy and site level, but you're able to say, all right, for let's say a particular client, they want to receive notifications themselves, or maybe you're out to prove a point that show how much data you are responsible for parsing through for a client. You can come down here and add them as a recipient, and then just enable whatever notifications for whatever events you want to have happen. You can also enable it to be output on a syslog. So this is another one of those significant differences that may not have the gap closed with the integrated version. You're able to come in here and tell it that, hey, I want all of the information from EDR being pushed out to a syslog server somewhere for a collection, so it can be pushed into a NOC SOC SIM solution elsewhere. Back to the actual threat events themselves, I want to spend just a minute or two here back going over these, because this, on all honesty, this analyze tab of actually looking into threat events and understanding them is a whole other 2 hours worth of boot camp. We are working on putting that together, but I just want to put, help get some perspective on this and a little bit of how you should interact with it. I already went through the quick and easy, dirty way of saying, oh, I recognize that, let me add it to exclusions. Oh, no, I have no clue what that is. It's a good thing EDR blocked it. Let me mark it as resolved. But you can also expand these out and get a little bit more information about it. So were there any indicators about this that made us say it was bad, what they were, where it was on the system, how many, the time of it, which engine caught it. So here it was caught as a Trojan, but it was as a classification, but it was caught by one of the static engines. And if I click into the threat, it's going to give me even more information. I'll have the ability to have an expanded view on the threat indicators, a little bit easier read on the process of what user launched it, what process was responsible for it. So here it says explorer.exe. That gives me fairly high confidence that somebody double clicked on something to run this. And then there's the hash value for it down here. And if I have an account with a recorded future, I could go out there, or I can use VirusTotal. And the purpose of this is to allow you to leverage the wisdom of the community. This will take the hash for that payload file, go search it on VirusTotal, and show you, well, this is what everybody else is saying about it. So you can see if other AVs are checking it out or not. So if there's a sizable amount of other AVs that are detecting it, that can give you fairly good confidence that, yep, that was a positive detection and it should be stopped. Or if there's like nobody else detecting it, you get into a different situation of, well, it's a false positive, or EDR is catching something before everybody else is catching it, which is also a possibility. But then you've also got the additional knowledge in here, such as behavior, community comments on this. So this can be very useful for the, I'm not using it as an AV, I'm building a whole security service around this. Well, part of what you can be doing is you're going to come in here and see, get this additional information. It's making communication out with an external IP address. Let's go block that on our perimeter firewalls. Or if it's creating registry keys on the system, or modifying registry keys to certain values, or it's adding certain files, use that information. Go to your RMM platform, RMM or N-central, add a custom script or a custom service monitor to look for that registry key or for that file on your whole client base. And if anything comes back as a positive hit, you've got something to go have a conversation about. You can go to the client and let them know this is an indicator of compromise we discovered in your environment. The only reason we found it is because we were using an advanced security solution on our other clients. It was able to find and stop it there for them automatically. But for you, since we don't have that solution, we're only finding out after the fact. You've already got problems. This is why we need to transition you to this solution. So we're not showing up days, weeks, months later saying, oh, by the way, we found this indicator in your environment that you probably had this virus 3 or 4 months ago and we never caught it because you're just using regular AV. So we're at the end of the hour. Looks like I've gotten all the questions answered that came in as we went along. Feel free, if there's any additional questions you have, I am going to throw my email address in the chat here. We are going to be doing a more in-depth boot camp later that is going to be more devoted to how do you leverage this Analyze tab? How do you use the Explore tab and the process waterfall of the things that it gives you? How do you build a incident response report based on the information that's in here, and how you can, take your choice. Are you going to build that out as a canned response that you're just going to, have as a copy paste for technicians into help desk tickets, or are you actually going to build out a full, 1 page, page and a half, 2-page incident report for clients, because that's what you're being paid for. Thank you very much, everybody, for showing up today and for your participation. Make sure you're checking out the boot camps going forward and keeping your eye open for those new ones. If you wanted more of the business side conversation here, how do I market this? How do I build packages around it? Check out the boot camps that Stephanie Hammond is doing on building managed services programs. They're very, very worthwhile, especially if you're in that phase of, just getting into how do I transition from the old MSP model of I'm selling you a service to make sure I'm optimizing your uptime so that your computers turn on Monday morning and your printers print when they want to, making that transition to, yeah, we do that stuff, but what we really do is provide security. Been a pleasure, everybody. Hope you have a good rest of your day, good weekend, and hopefully we'll see you on some future boot camps or office hours.